Hello again, this is Don with Osiris Studios. Going to be doing a tutorial today about sculpting some rocks for a cave for the game Mist of Stagnation. You can see here this is what the final result is going to look like. Got the handful of different assets here. Got the cave entrance and a couple of different rocks we used to make some of the surrounding mountains for it. The tutorial we're going to be going over is just the main cave entrance. You can use the same techniques that we use on it to do all the other rocks. Alright, so the first thing I always like to do when I'm making an asset that isn't an exact size is create a size of the player model there. Then what you see me doing is that second box is going to be the entrance of the cave, so I can create the main asset around it. So just blocking out the low resolution mesh that we're going to bring into Mudbox. One thing that's important is you're taking a model from 3DS into a high poly sculpting application like Mudbox, is that you're modeling in quads and that it's going to subdivide nicely when you get it in there, so that way you don't have any weird stretching. Just dropping an edit poly modifier on top of it there, so that way I can always go back and take those out later if I want to. I'm actually going to be using a different program to reduce the amount of polygons instead of going back to edit it, but that only works on certain kinds of models. Alright, throwing a turbo smooth modifier on it just to see what it's going to look like once I get it into Mudbox. You see some of those curves there are pretty loose, so I'm just going to go ahead and throw a connect modifier on, or connect some of those vertexes to tighten it up. See that entrance is a little bit tighter now, so that way I can sculpt it the way I want it. Always make sure you get rid of that turbo smooth modifier before you export it. Otherwise you're going to run into some weird errors in Mudbox. So exporting it as a OBJ model. Now in Mudbox I'm going to go ahead and pull that in here. I'm going to hit Shift D to subdivide it and just check it out, make sure there's no weird errors on it. Alright, so I'm going to subdivide it a couple times to get it pretty fine there, so that way I can start blocking out some of the main details. I'm just using the grab tool right now to shape the entrance. Just pulling on it, going back and fixing it. If you hold down Shift, you'll smooth it out as you go along. So you'll see me just shape and smooth, shape and smooth. Alright, so I'm just going to add some larger detail with the Sculpt tool now. This is really just blocking it out, getting an idea of what I want to do with it, making it some larger rocks that I can go and put some finer detail on later. Alright, I go over to the Scrape tool. This is probably the best tool there ever was for making any kind of rocks. It just really gives it that nice look that looks like it makes it look like a rock. Go over all those hard surfaces. Later on you'll see me go over any of the smooth surfaces as well. This tool alone is what makes Mudbox worth everything. Alright, you'll notice I'm only doing one side of this. It's because the interior isn't really going to be seen for the whole back of it, so I'm just doing the part that will be seen there. Alright, now going back to Sculpt, subdividing it up again to add some finer detail on it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put a stencil over it here, so that way I can get an outline for what I want to do. Even though it is bricks, what I want to do here is get a layered rock look. So I'm just going to really use that as a guide. Alright, so now I'm just going in and fine-tuning that, adding just a higher details, shaping out those rocks a little bit more. Using the pinch tool just to get some of the creases a little bit tighter. See, I'm going back and forth with the sculpt tool and the scrape tool, just shaping it out the way I like it. Now you can spend a ton of time on this or a little time. It really depends how profile this model is going to be in the game, to how much time you really want to spend on it. For me, this is going to be in a really dark area of the level, so the detail isn't going to be that important, but you still want that main shape to be seen. You can go in here and draw some finer details of the rocks just to give it some good depth. A lot of times when you're baking normals, you need to overdo it sometimes just to get that detail out in your normal map. You see, still going back and forth with the sculpt and the scrape. Just about the only two tools I'll even use to do this whole thing with. Main thing that I like to do to make sure I get a good rock here is anytime you see a bubble, you want to just go over it with that scrape, so that way you get those nice sharp edges. Alright, so I'll subdivide it again and start going up to pretty high here, and this is where I'm going to put the fine detail on using a stamp image and just going over it with the sculpt tool. I'll tone the strength down, that way I'm not changing the topology of the model too much. But as you go over it, make sure you get down in all the cracks and everything too. You can smooth out still by holding shift if you need to. Just make sure you go back over it afterwards, otherwise you'll get a real muffled look. Alright, now I'm going to select my object and export it. Alright, so we're going to export two different versions of this model. We're going to do the high poly one. It's going to be used for our bake. Then I'm also going to take it down to a lower poly, and that's going to be used when we bring it into this program, which is called MeshLab. We're going to use it to make our lower poly model. So we'll bring it in there. We're going to go up to Filter, Remeshing, Simplification, and Reconstruction, then Quadratic Edge Collapse Decimation. And then for target number of faces, it's self-explanatory. You just want to put in the total number you want, hit apply, watch it do its thing, and then it brings it down. Just make sure you export that mesh and give it a new name. That way if you ever have to change it, you can. Back in 3DX now, just want to make sure we name our layers really well so that way we can get around easily. Something like this where you only have a couple of objects, it's pretty easy. I just do it just as a good habit. So we're going to bring in our newly created low poly mesh that we made in MeshLab, as well as our high poly mesh we exported from Mudbox. Going to go ahead and hide the high poly until we need it in a minute, and then unwrap our low poly. So we're just going to throw a unwrap UVW modifier on it. And go to an edge selection. And we're just going to build our own seams here, and then we're going to peel it. I find this is really the only way to get a good UV on these. If you haven't used this before, it's a really cool tool. It's probably one of the only ones you'll use after this. But what we're doing is we're just creating the different seams. We're drawing our seams for when we peel it. And you just want to keep in mind what's going to be seen by the player from what angle, so that way if you do need to create harsh seams, it's not that big of a deal. So those bottom pieces there are probably never going to be seen. We're also going to separate the front and top from the back of it to give it its own textures there. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and go over to face now, pick a face, and then the button over in the Seams tab will select all faces that are connected within that seam. Here I'm just closing off that seam from the front on the other side. Alright, so going back to face and selecting all faces within that seam. Then we're going to go ahead and hit our peel button. I like to turn all the samples all the way up so I can go. Sometimes I'll expand my springs on it. Start the pellet. Once it looks good, hit commit. What you want to look for on these is make sure that you're not getting any twisting where you're getting overlapping faces. If it is, you just need to redo your seam some. I'm going to do the same thing on the other pieces now. So you can see if you haven't used this method before, it makes things a lot easier for you. And the last one. So after I have them all here, I'm going to scale them somewhat close to what they need to be. Put a checkered texture on it just so we can see what it looks like. You can see there's some stretching, so we're going to go ahead and pack them all in. And then we're going to go to the relax tool. Changing iterations up to 200. It really depends on the model and how much curvature you have in your topology. I change it up to like 250, 200, and just hit apply a couple of times until you see it start to look better. I'll go back and forth between relaxed face biangle and edge biangle, just depending on the model itself. And then just keep doing it until you have no stretching in your model. Now I repack them here just using the repack tool. Later on you'll see me come back and fix it again because you see there's a lot of wasted UV space there. Here I'm just going to throw a checkered material on it just to be able to see what it looks like again, make sure there's no stretching and that everything's scaled appropriately. Alright, so I'm bringing back the high poly model and I'm going to create a material for it. Going to make a ray trace material and just set a basic color that the rock's going to be. We're going to use this in combination with some other textures to make it look good. Alright, bringing the low poly mesh back, we're going to add a projection modifier on it. And then bring the high poly mesh back on again. Going to go in the cage, reset it, and push it out. I also click shaded. It just makes it a little easier on models like this to make sure that you're completely encompassing the high poly mesh. Alright, I hit 0 for render to texture. And we're going to enable projection mapping and then pick the high poly mesh that we have. Then what we're going to do is change our render to mental ray so that way we can get a nice ambient occlusion map. So as we're picking the different maps we're going to do a diffuse, a height map, an ambient occlusion, and then a normal map. I'm going to turn off normal map for now because I'm going to do that under the default scanline render. And right now I'm just going to make a really small model, or a really small render, so that way it's quick and I can see if there's any errors. You'll usually know if you are not completely encompassing your model if you see any red on there. Here I'm just going through and taking a look at the 3 different renders to make sure they turned out okay. That's where I noticed that my UV was off, so now I'm going to go back and fix that. So since those are the 2 main pieces, they're going to get the bulk of the screen space here. Not really too worried about the scaling of it and the others. So now I'm using more of my space. I could probably get a little bit better use out of it, but not really that important for this model once again. More complex models, you're going to want to use as much space as possible so you can get a high resolution on it. Alright, so now that I know that everything's going to be good, going back in, going to change my resolutions back to 2048 by 2048. Give it a naming convention that'll be easy for you later. And once again, I have diffuse, height, and ambient occlusion turned on, and normal map turned off right now. I'm going to render that separately. Also going to go back into my rendering options and change the sampling quality to a minimum of 1 and a maximum of 64. Depending on what you're doing, you can change that even higher. The higher that is, the longer it's going to take. So I kind of skipped through the rendering process there for you so you don't have to wait through it. And then just taking a look at them to make sure there's no errors on them. I'm going to disable the diffuse, height map, and ambient, and enable the normal map. Then I'm going to go back and change my renderer again to default scanline renderer. The reason I do that is I find sometimes I'll get errors when I use the other renderer for my normal maps. So everything looks good there. We're going to go ahead and move into Photoshop now. Make sure while you're here you go ahead and export your low poly mesh. Just saves you an extra trip back. You can also go ahead and take a look at your textures, how they're going to look, just by throwing them on your model there. There's the ambient occlusion. Here's the height map. Some good shading detail in there you can see. And then the normal map. Just another way to look at them, see if there's any errors. Alright, in Photoshop, we're going to go ahead and import all of our textures in there. First thing we're going to do is edit your normal map. Normal map's pretty easy. All you need to do is change the levels a little bit. This is true with just about any kind of normal map there is. And it's just to get a little bit better use out of that texture. Also, I'm going to get rid of the alpha channel. When you import alpha channels into UDK, you're using double the texture memory. So I kind of double up and also import it without an alpha anyway, but just out of habit I'll get rid of alpha channels if I don't need them. Doing the same thing with the diffuse, I'll go ahead and get rid of that alpha just by dragging it onto the trash. I'll duplicate my background so that way I always have a copy of the original if I ever need it. And then I'll use the dropper to get a sample of the color, and then hit Alt and Backspace to fill the screen with that. Got my ambient occlusion map. I'm going to copy it over into my diffuse texture 2 times. And this is going to be our main lighting detail that we're using. This is baked lighting, essentially, is what we're doing here. Now UDK is going to use a lot of real-time lighting, but this is just going to give it a little bit better look. First version of it I'm going to put as an overlay. Second, I'm going to go to a multiply just to darken it up a little bit. And you can play with the opacity levels on there just to get it how you want it. You don't want it to be too dark because you still are going to have lighting on top of that. But you want it to have enough to get some good detail in there. In Photoshop, if you start getting complicated textures, it's good to make folders. Just going to help you with your own organization later. Alright, now over in the height map, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to Select, Load, and then I'm going to pick the alpha mask, or the alpha channel, and create a mask. Then I'm going to apply that to that layer. That way I can move it over into my diffuse texture. Keep in mind you're always going to want your AO on the top level because you always want your lighting to affect everything else. For the height map, I'm going to go to an overlay, and I take it down pretty low because you can see it's some pretty harsh shadow detail in there. But it does have some good detail for it. Alright, now I'm going to bring in some rock textures that I got. Various websites you can get it from. Some good high resolution maps in there. Cool thing is you don't have to worry about it being tiled or anything like that, because you can do that on your own. I also have a couple of detail masks that I'll be adding in there later. Just getting everything sorted to add in here. So just Control A to select it all, then hit V and drag it into your other. Each time you do that, it'll by default create a new layer for you. You can sort them as you want just to get the layered effect that you want, and then just make sure that they're all fitting your screen space that you need. Alright, once they're in, you're going to want to change them to an overlay. Now this is the reason why we created that color on the original render. It's because we're going to use that color to affect all these. So once you're at overlay, you can go in and just affect the opacity on it. Going back down to the background, which is my color that I use to render off of, I'll change the hue on it to get the right color that I like. You can also hit Control L and change some of the levels on it. Control U will get you into the hue and saturation levels. I'll go back and forth from the opacity on the 3 textures that I use with the different levels in the hue of my base texture. The lower you take the saturation, the closer it'll get to the gray rock, while as the higher you'll get more of an earth tone rock. Mess with the levels on some of my ambient occlusion there to lighten up after all the darkness I just put in. And there you're getting a pretty good idea of what our texture is going to look like. Now I don't use the masked version of it because there's really no need to. I just use it as a reference so I can get a better idea of where my texture space is. You can see our baked lighting in there looking pretty good though. Just don't want to make it overly dark. Just going in for some last minute fixes here. Another reason why you have your ambient on the top is because as you change your levels, you don't want to have to go back and fix your lighting again. Changing some of the levels just to make that lighting a little bit darker in the crevices again. Control H will turn off your helpers like the grid. That way it can help you see some of the finer detail in there. Just saving a copy of it here before I add in the decals. Sometimes it's good to have 2 versions of it in case you need to have, say for example, one version that's in the sunlight where you wouldn't have moss and one version that is not. So here's my 2 decals. I have a kind of a rust texture, dripping rust, and then a algae texture. Just going to add them in their own layers on top of the fuse but under ambient. With different decals you can play around with the blending mode. I find that overlay works best on most of these because you'll get a lot of the color information transferred into it. Yeah, make sure you're grabbing the right level as you start moving all these around. This is why saving is helpful too. Just adding a second one in here in a little different location, size, and rotation. And right there is another reason why having that masked version in there is still helpful, because it gives you a good awareness of your texture space. Create another folder for my decals. Then I'll bring in the last one. If you ever use something like this that uses drips, it's good to know which direction is up and down on your texture or on your UV. That's why I'm turning it upside down here, because I know that the top of my model is actually at the bottom of my texture sheet. This is just going to simulate a dripping or rust, like if there's a high metal content in these rocks. Changing it to overlay and then just blending it in with the opacity level. Just gives it a nice warm look. Alright, save that out as your diffuse. And now we're going to bring it all into UDK. Alright, so I'm going to import my mesh first. It's all one piece, so nothing fancy has to be done here. See, no errors there, it all came in good. UV looks good. So since my UV didn't have any overlapping faces, I changed my light map coordinate index to 0, and it's just going to share the same light map as my UV, or as my texture. When I'm importing the textures, you see I clicked compression, no alpha. That's just a second way to do it where you don't have to delete the alpha out of it in Photoshop, but you're not using up double the texture memory. Alright, so I got my normal and my diffuse in there now. I'm going to go ahead and bring them in and create a material. Something like this where it's only going to be used on one model, it's good to go ahead and bring your model into that material so you can see it in real time as you're editing it. I just make a real simple texture here. I go back in later and add some detail normal maps to it, so I'll probably end up showing you in another tutorial. But just diffuse into the diffuse and normal into the normal. Compile it, and then throw it on your model. Now you see there I have the light map resolution at 512. That is really overkill. I ended up changing it back to 64. But we're going to go ahead and throw that into a test map here and walk around, make sure it all looks good. And you can see a model like this doesn't take you very long at all to do. It really depends on how much you're going to be seeing this model. If it's something that's in a dark area, you don't really need to spend a whole lot of time on it. Just pump these kind of assets out really quick and get a fairly good look out of them too. This model alone probably took me less than an hour to put together. Alright, now let's take a look at some of the other models we made for this asset pack. There's the entrance we just made. Also have some other ones for the interior of the cave. There's the floor. Use the same process. There's a side of it, and then a second variation of the side, so that way it doesn't tile. This piece here I use in a different part of the map for cliffs. It's just a little V there that I can use so I can have two sides on one model. Double up the efficiency of it. And then just some basic rocks that I can break up those cliffs with to give it a little bit more detail. Alright, so here we are on the level. Let's see, this is the models I just showed you. Just put together real quick to give you a good example of how a handful of assets in a few hours can give you a really good look. See, there's not a lot of tiling or anything. This is what we're looking at here is really just three models. Have the two sides and the floor. You can see if you take your time on it, you can even make a full cave system out of this with just three models that doesn't have a repetitive look to it at all. And you can see we use the entrance model again up here. Now that's where a good place to have a model without the actual moss on it would be. Well, thanks for watching, guys. That is our tutorial, and check back for more.